In this presentation, we're going to pick up where we left off with Lecture 1, and we're going to be talking about congressional elections. And some of these details we're going to see don't necessarily sound important on their own, but we're going to flesh out the consequences as we go. And also, as a note before you get started writing things down, part of the reason that we are shifting to recorded notes for you to work on outside of class time is I want students to really practice writing more than just what is in the bullet points, more than just what goes on the screen. So remember, when you get to college, you are going to have professors who may not write anything on the board at all. They may have nothing up on the screen. And so you need to get kind of in the habit of organizing things and writing down what is said rather than just what you can see. All right, with that, let's get started. At the outset of this, we need to note that elections are conducted only by the states. Even if we call them federal elections, states administer all of them. And they set a lot of the rules, well, they set most of the rules for elections, with, we're going to see some exceptions. And the first is this: all congressional elections, and in presidential years, presidential elections occur on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And when we're focusing on congressional elections as we are here, that happens in all even years. And as a result, we have a distinction to make between presidential election years, as in the one we just had in 2024, versus midterm. You will sometimes see these also referred to as off-year elections. And off-year elections we'll have in 2026. Turnout is higher in presidential years, and this is not something just to note for kicks. As we're going to see, that has consequences. People care more about presidential elections, kind of like more people watch the Super Bowl than will watch the third game of a football season. And more people are interested, more people bother to go vote. They feel like those elections are more significant. And there certainly is a lot more attention and hype around presidential elections. One of the consequences of higher turnout in presidential years is something called coattails. And now, in presentation, notice that sometimes is in italics because sometimes is important. There are lots of political science studies about whether there are coattails, to what extent are there coattails. So what are coattails? Coattails refer to a situation in which voter support for a winning president kind of has a halo effect, and it leads to more support for what we call down ballot candidates. And those would be, for our purposes here, among them would be congressional elections, House elections, Senate elections, because those elections happen below the presidential and vice presidential choices at the top of the ballot. The key here is support for candidates of the same party. This does not always happen, right, as this political cartoon can indicate, and this one is from the 2016 election. I'm pointing out that in the case of Donald Trump's first elections, there weren't a lot of coattails. That didn't seem to translate into support for Republicans down ballot. And one of the reasons this may happen is there's kind of a theory in political science that there's something called cognitive Madisonianism. And that is the idea that for some Americans, as they think about their voting choices, they don't want to have a president or one party controlling the presidency and Congress. They prefer a divided government for more likely checks and balances between the executive and legislative branches. And this may be something that plays also into midterm elections. midterm elections, as I said, scheduling doesn't sound important and it doesn't sound interesting, but it has interesting and important effects. In midterms or off-year elections, turnout is lower. Fewer people are interested. Fewer people bother to vote. And so the people that do vote tend to be people who are generally more engaged in politics. And in these elections, the party controlling the presidency typically loses representation in Congress. How much varies from election to election, but typically they lose seats in Congress, and often this means that a president who may have entered office having his co-partisans controlling Congress, or at least one house of Congress, finds the loss of one or both houses of Congress to the opposition party. And this may also partly be because of cognitive Madisonianism. A lot of times we talk about, and we will talk about in the presidency, the first 100 days, where presidents are very active trying to get their agenda put through while they still have, sometimes also referred to as the honeymoon period after a presidential election, when they're more likely to have support in Congress and a mandate from the public, or at least can claim a mandate from the public. And so they'll do a lot. We certainly are seeing in the case of Donald Trump's second term, a very active presidency and congressional support for the agenda so far. If cognitive Madisonianism is a theory with support in the evidence, then part of the reason that the party of the president typically loses seats in Congress at midterm elections is voters have a reaction to all of that policy activity, all of that legislative activity coming out of the first 2 years of a presidential term. And they may seek that Madisonian balance between the branches. As we talk about elections, we also need to note that there are differences between the House and the Senate. For the House, every member is elected every 2 years, or biennially. Biennially, there we go. Which means, and this does not happen, but in theory, you could have an entirely new House of Representatives. All 435 incumbents lose, and you get 435 brand new representatives. Of course, that does not happen, but because of the fact that all members of the House are up for election every 2 years, or biennially, I just want to say, just to prove I can, there is a potential for new rules, especially because the party in control may change every 2 years, in addition to lots of the members potentially changing. The House is different. There, only 1/3 of members are elected every 2 years, which means 2/3 of your membership carries over. Okay, so we number Congresses based on essentially the House. We have a new Congress. The Senate goes by those same numbers, but the Senate is can't even possibly be all new every 2 years. Because of this carryover of the majority of members, the Senate is referred to as either a continuous body or a continuing body, depending on what text you're reading or who you're talking to. And for this reason, the Senate is a source of stability. You can have a new president. You can have a very new House with a very different direction and new leaders. The Senate is more stable. And for that reason also, we don't see the big rule changes in the Senate that we see in the House. Doesn't mean there are never rule changes, but not the same way we see in the House. Now, as for these elections, how do you win an election? What does it take? Well, your best bet, if you want to win an election to Congress, is to already be there. Incumbents have the best shot at winning. I mean, what we can see here, these are re-election rates over the past 60 years. And let me move. There we go. I mean, at a low, it's still above 50%. All right, and that is a dramatic low. And in some cases, as high as 100%. I don't know that that was actually exactly 100%, but it sure looks like it. But usually we can expect it to be above 80%, and likely would average out to mid to high 80s. The House has an even stronger track record of incumbent reelection. And if we look in the past 60 years, there is never one that dips below 80%. And these aren't just because in the House that incumbents are squeaking by with slim majorities. These are the average margins of victory over the past, well, from 2012 to 2024. And those are large margins of victory. Sometimes they're larger than others. I mean, there's nearly a 10 percentage point difference between 2016 and 2024, but those are still huge margins of victory. If a president were to win by that margin of victory, it would be considered, landslide wouldn't even be strong enough a term for that kind of presidential margin of victory, right? But in the House, large margins are typical. And of course, I probably should have mentioned this before, and of course you can see it now. Incumbent means the current office holder. Okay, so whoever holds it now, running to retain their seat. We do need to understand that the rate of reelection and large margins of victory are only part of the story. So one of the things to understand here, because if we just look at those graphs, nobody ever leaves Congress. Well, the small minority who manage not to hold on to their seats could lose. And this graph shows us tenure in Congress, right? And we have two lines, one for the Senate, one for the House. The tenures have often been getting longer, but as you can see, there's up and down. But in the House, the average years of service, prior service in the chamber as of the 118th Congress, 8.5 years for the House, over 11 years for the Senate. And so we do have senators and representatives who leave, and oftentimes this is through retirement, and that's something we'll talk about as a factor. What gives incumbents an advantage? It turns out it's not incumbent advantage, it's incumbent advantages. But we always just call it the incumbent advantage. Okay? Let's unpack this though. So one element is credit claiming. And that is claiming credit for your accomplishments as a senator or representative. And one of the ways of doing this is through casework, which you can see in this image. This is a screen grab from Sam Graves' website. He is your 6th district representative in the United States House for our part of Missouri. And if you go to his website, there are all kinds of services you can click on. And one of the big ones for casework is help with a federal agency. But it's also, if you want to give as a gift to someone, to commemorate something, maybe to honor a deceased relative, you can ask for a flag to be flown over, say, the White House or over the Capitol building, and then given to you later with documentation that that's what happened. And so these are just the kinds of services that can happen, and then members of Congress can brag about how they've helped people. There will also, of course, be word of mouth as people say, wow, man, my congressman helped me resolve this problem, helped me get that Social Security check that my grandparent was waiting on, those kinds of things. And of course, we also have here something we've seen before, pork barrel spending or earmarks. The money they bring home to their district. A lot of times they will, if that money goes to build something, they will make sure their name is on that building. Okay, so everybody knows that they brought that money home to the district. They may also claim credit for their legislative record. Now, whether this is a big part of their credit claiming or not depends on whether they are in a safe district, or if we're talking about the Senate, a solidly Republican or Democrat state. If they are in one of those situations, they're likely to brag about the things they've voted for or against because they can count on their constituents approving of those voting decisions. But it's nice to remind your voters, if this works out for you, that you are taking actual stands on actual policy that lines up with their values and opinions. There's also position taking, which is what it sounds like, taking positions on key issues. And again, this is going to also depend on if you are in a safe seat. If you are, then you will trumpet your opinion on different policy issues. And you'll see this a lot from members of Congress. You can subscribe to the email newsletter from Sam Graves' office, and you will often see that Sam Graves will take kind of very strong public stances on key issues, because we're going to see, as we return to Sam Graves as an example, and none of this is political on my part, and I'm not trying to influence you at all, but he is your representative, and he is in a safe seat. And so we're going to kind of see that. We'll use him as an example for those things. Advertising is another advantage for incumbents. And of course, we can be talking about paid advertisements in election years. You may see advertisements in all kinds of media, but it isn't just that. Members of Congress have free advertising advantages that challengers do not have. And one of those is the franking privilege. And members of Congress do not have to have a stamp. They can send mailed communication to their constituents without paying postage. They just need to have their name on it. And they, of course, also in the internet age, you are likely to receive, especially if you sign up, say, for an email newsletter, targeted digital communications. Some offices are going to be more sophisticated at this than others, but that member of Congress can communicate to you specifically on issues that they have identified as important to you. And this gives incumbents something that you might not think matters a lot, but it does, and that is simply name recognition. People are more likely to vote for a name that is familiar to them. And so it's incredibly important. There are also, rules. Candidates would like to be the first name listed for any office. I mean, that's how important your name being known, your name being seen first matters, and especially in terms of just having your name known, incumbents have a tremendous advantage. The next incumbent advantage component is campaign spending. For one thing, incumbents have less need for money, and at the same time they have less need for it, they also usually have more money for campaign spending than their challengers. This is especially true in House races. Incumbents typically have accumulated what is referred to as a war chest, a large amount of funding set back for the next campaign. And incumbents are always trying to raise money. Right? You will hear one thing incumbents will complain about is that the campaign never really ends. This war chest itself is something that discourages candidates from the other party, or even candidates from your own party who might challenge you in a primary election, because they can look at how much money they're up against and realize they're never going to be able to get their name and their message out as effectively as the incumbent. Now, I already kind of alluded to this, but incumbents can raise money far more easily. for one thing, I mean, they can show that they have taken action that individuals, corporations would support and use that as a way to kind of encourage donations to their campaign. As a result, incumbents can outspend their challengers, and it's usually by a lot. And what this amounts to, I mean, lots of money gets spent. This is the dollar value in billions of dollars for right now. We don't care about the yellow part. That's presidential races, but congressional elections. 2020, more than $10 billion. The same thing again in 2024. And in particular for Sam Graves, this is from his most recent election. You look at the difference in the amounts raised. And again, Sam Graves is in a very safe seat. As we're going to see, it's very difficult for the Democrats to field anything like a strong challenger, and seemingly everybody knows that. And people do not contribute money, or at least are obviously far less likely to contribute money to what's likely a losing cause. So the difference is, I mean, huge in that spending. Party identification is also part of this. And really, we need to think about it kind of as part of the story, but also very much its own thing. Party identification is now, in relative terms, more important than other elements of incumbent advantage. And the reason for this is that most House members can now count on having a large majority of co-partisans in their district to give them this advantage. And this is something that has developed, especially in recent decades, as partisanship has increased, or at least in the sense that even if we have lots of people in the United States who consider themselves independents, members of the two parties or supporters of the two parties are more partisan. They're more dedicated to their particular team and less likely to vote for candidates from the other party. As a result of this, we get more party line voting, meaning a person votes for all of the candidates from top of the ballot to the bottom of the ballot for candidates of the same party. And some states have made this more difficult, and yet party line voting continues to be more pronounced. Missouri is an example of this. When I started voting, you could in Missouri, you could pick up your ballot, and there was a bubble you could mark at the top of the ballot that indicated that you wanted all of your votes for elected offices to go to candidates from the same party. They've done away with that option, and yet party line voting continues to be something that is more prominent, just as an example. Playing into this is also, or building on this, is also the issue of safe seats. Party identification advantage for incumbents means that incumbent has a safe seat. Safe seats do not happen by accident. Party identification advantages do not happen by accident. These are by design. State legislatures are responsible for drawing congressional districts within the states, and state legislatures, being controlled by one party or the other, tend to draw safe seat districts for members of Congress. Remember, this only applies for the House. Senate candidates do not have districts within a state. They represent the whole state. More on that later. New technology also happens with this. Things like GIS and census data, all kinds of things, and other data that parties are able to gather allows them to really dial in safe seat district shapes for incumbents. And what we're talking about here is gerrymandering. And we'll mention it here, and we'll talk more about gerrymandering in a bit. Just for now, so you don't see this weird word with no meaning to it, gerrymandering refers to drawing district lines to advantage one party's candidates over the candidates of another party. And this also contributes to the phenomenon of weak opponents, especially for, again, the House. As we've already seen, the war chests that incumbents have in terms of money can intimidate strong challengers. Opponents are unlikely to have strong campaigns. It's hard to get people to volunteer to work for a campaign that is likely to lose. It's hard to have money because, just like people don't want to volunteer, they don't really want to give money to a cause they know is not going to be successful. Without money, you also can't hire professional campaign staff that would make you a stronger candidacy or make your candidacy stronger. Right, and so we have strong incumbents facing weak opponents. And again, we see that here in the raising and spending of money by Sam Graves and his Democrat challenger, Pam May. I mean, it's not even close.